In my last programme, I warned against any over-high expectations or fears that the European Parliament elections, which were underway yesterday, would lead to drastic changes in the overall direction and course of policy within the European Union. And this sceptical comment of mine was based on long experience of European politics. Well, in a sense, I was correct. If we look at the overall makeup of the European Parliament, it is clear that the neoliberal majority is still very much the majority, despite advances by so-called populist parties in many places. The overall position of the neoliberal majority has declined from 69% of the total MEPs by affiliation to around 62% by affiliation of the various MEPs. In other words, the European Parliament still has a solid majority that continues to support the course that the European Commission and the European authorities have steered, and which, on the great geopolitical issue of our times, the conflict in Ukraine, continues to be solidly supportive of Western policy with respect to Ukraine. Having said that, I'm going to say straight away that I undoubtedly did underestimate the political shifts in individual countries. There's been, for example, a significant shift in Greece since the parliamentary elections that took place in Greece some time ago. It seems to me that the governing party, New Democracy, has clearly lost a very significant amount of support, and both right-wing and left-wing parties, which certainly seem to function or avowedly function outside the neoliberal centre, that they have gained in support and strength. Of course, the two most important countries, France and Germany, there we do see signs of a very significant shift. In France, the governing party, the party of Emmanuel Macron, crashed to just around 15% of the vote, and Marine Le Pen's party swept the board, gaining more than double the support of the party of the president, of Emmanuel Macron. Her party now gained around 33% of the vote. In Germany, the swing has been perhaps less dramatic, but then electoral shifts in Germany historically have always been less dramatic than one would expect in France. And in this case, in my opinion, they are still fairly dramatic overall. Now, the party that emerged with the largest share of the vote in these European Parliament elections, and it's perhaps important to say that the turnout at, I believe, around 65% was high. Anyway, the party that emerged as the biggest party was the Christian Democrat, Christian Social Union Alliance, the party of Adenauer, Erhard, Helmut Kohl, and Angela Merkel, that grouping, and it's currently in opposition, and it's led by Friedrich Merz, if there were parliamentary elections in Germany tomorrow, would, on the basis of these results, emerge as the Chancellor. Having said that, I'm going to suggest that 30%, which is the figure that the CDU-CSU have gained, is in some ways a rather disappointing figure for the main opposition party in Germany at this point in the electoral cycle. Firstly, it is significantly below the polling numbers that the combined CDU-CSU has achieved in the period of its ascendancy. It was extremely rare, as I remember, for the CDU-CSU to fall below 40%. Sometimes it was substantially more than that. It was very much the dominant party, certainly in Western Germany, where arguably, by the way, it still is, but even in the united Germany that has emerged since German reunification in 1990. So this is an underwhelming vote for the CDU-CSU in that sense. But it's also the vote that the major opposition party in Germany has achieved at a time of extreme unpopularity for the governing parties that make up the current German government. And this perhaps is the key point to take away. When the government is as unpopular in Germany as it is at the moment, you would expect, or at least I would expect, a major swing in the electoral pendulum in favour of the main opposition party, especially if that party is a party like the CDU-CSU, which has led Germany so often in recent history, and which is to a great extent the party that many Germans associate with the whole conception of the Bundesrepublik. Now, clearly there has been a small swing towards the CDU-CSU, but it's clear that it is not capitalising on the unpopularity of the current German government to anything like the extent that one would expect that it would. And if we look at the results of the German governing parties, well, I have to say that they look grim. They look extremely bad indeed. So the SPD, the oldest political party in Germany, going all the way back to the era of Bismarck, the party that was once supported by Karl Marx and which has people like Liebknecht and others as its members. Anyway, that party has now crashed to apparently around 13.9% of the vote. I mean, that is an astonishing crash. And it came third behind the CDU-CSU, which came first, and it came third behind the AfD, which got just under 16% of the vote. And if we go to the other parties in the governing coalition, we see a huge collapse in the vote for the Greens. In some ways, the most dynamic and energetic part of the German governing coalition, the one which, in a sense, has made policy over Ukraine, over international relations generally, over economic policy. It controls the foreign ministry through Annalena Baerbock and the economics ministry since under Robert Habeck. Robert Habeck himself is, of course, the vice-chancellor. Well, they've crashed. They were polling, as I remember, at the previous European Parliament elections, 20.5% of the vote, a level which many at one time assumed would enable them to grow to become the biggest party on the left, overtaking the SPD itself. Anyway, they crashed to just under 12%. In other words, they've lost around 9%. 9%, they've lost 9 percentage points. They've gone down 9 percentage points. They've lost around a third of their vote, of around 40% of their vote. A massive crash. And that also puts them well behind the AfD. And the FDP, the Liberal Party, third party in the coalition, well, they're at 5.2%. Apparently that's stable. But again, they're living dangerously. They're very close to the 5% margin, which, if they fall below, they would potentially lose their representation in the Bundestag. And again, even as the right-wing anti-establishment forces in Germany have crystallized around the AfD, which gained just under 16% of the vote, and which makes it the second biggest party in Germany, ahead of the SPD. It's also the case that Sarah Wagenknecht's party, which has only just been formed, has also made a surprisingly strong showing. She got 6.2% of the vote, more than the FDP did, more than enough to gain representation in the Bundestag if there were elections tomorrow. And it's likely also that her vote will probably increase. She might, for example, continue to win support from left-wing, disenchanted left-wing voters who have previously voted for Die Linke, the former left-wing party, which is now significantly reduced. It's under 3%, and of course from the SDP as well. So a major swing, both on the right and on the left, against the historic German political establishment. And I suspect that this challenge to the establishment will grow. And note that the parties that are gaining support in this European Parliament election are precisely the parties which have been most strongly opposed to Germany's support for Ukraine and for the continuation of the war there. And there is, of course, also a significant regional difference. And it's a fact that in the former East Germany, the German territory of the former German Democratic Republic, well, there, more than 40% of German voters, East German voters, voted either for the AfD or for Sarah Wagenknecht's party, causing journalists like Julian Röpke of Bild Zeitung to complain that East Germans want to come back under Russian occupation again. A sneering comment, which I have to say shows an astonishing lack of understanding of the realities of German politics and of the shifts in mood in Germany today. And this pattern has repeated itself in many places. In Italy, for example, where Giorgia Meloni's government some months ago started to pivot away from its position of uncritical support for Ukraine. It's now increasingly been talking about negotiations and about the limits to which the Western powers should go in involving themselves in the Ukrainian conflict. Well, Giorgia Meloni's coalition, as a result, reaped the benefit. They were able to assert their strength in these elections, they saw off with ease the challenge from the more Atlanticist and interventionist parties to the left. And of course, in doing that, they reflect Italian opinion. And if we talk about other countries, Austria, for example, where, well, the Freedom Party, as I believe it's called, has emerged as the biggest party in these elections in Austria. There's apparently parliamentary elections coming in Austria. There's a high possibility that this party might win the largest share of the vote in those elections and could even form the government in Austria. And of course, it is straightforwardly opposed to the whole EU sanctions policy against Russia and wants a negotiation, an end to the war and conflict in Ukraine, and a re-establishment in economic links with Russia that have been so comprehensively severed over the last 3 years. So one could see the pendulum swing. And in France, coming back to France, President Macron, seeing the collapse of his party, sensing that if he allows the situation to continue as it has, that it will continue to drift out of his control, that support will continue to concentrate in Marine Le Pen's movement. He's tried to preempt that by taking the gamble of calling for early parliamentary elections later this month. Presumably, he's hoping to pull off the same trick that the Spanish Socialist Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, managed to pull off in Spain last year, when the Socialist Party and Mr. Sanchez also seemed to be behind in the polls against the right-wing opposition, but by calling elections and mobilizing left-of-centre opinion in Spain, particularly with fierce criticism, not just of the centre-right in Spain, but of the Vox party in particular, which was seen, which was represented as a throwback to the Franco era. Anyway, Sanchez successfully clawed back and brought the Spanish socialists and himself back into power, where of course he still is. So presumably Macron is gambling on pulling off the same trick in France. For the record, I think this is most unlikely. I think that France is a very different country from Spain, and I think Mr. Macron himself is a very different person from Mr. Sanchez. I think the political dynamics there are very different, and I think that by far the most likely outcome of the election in France is that there will be a very strong vote for Marine Le Pen's party, which is most likely to emerge as the largest party in the French Parliament, with Macron's party pushed to the margins. So, a significant swing in individual countries, and altogether a swing that points to increasing discomfort, hostility on the part of the European electorate with the war in Ukraine. And it is unsurprising. The war in Ukraine has been for Europe a catastrophe. The economic war has gone disastrously wrong. Expectations that the Russian economy would collapse have been confounded. Instead, the Russian economy is booming. In fact, it is booming so fast that the central bank is warning of the risks of overheating, correctly, in my opinion. And by contrast, Europe seems to be locked in the worst type of stagflation the economies in many countries appear to be in effective recession. Price pressure, however, remains strong. Living standards are eroding, and there's a general sense across Europe that the political class has lost touch with the concerns of the people it governs, and that it is focused instead exclusively on the war in Ukraine and has lost interest in the people it is supposed to be governing. And inevitably that is what has triggered this reaction. And of course, if we throw other issues like immigration into the mix, which we should, then of course that reinforces this feeling of an out-of-touch establishment even further. And in the case of France and Germany, the incredible belligerence of the political leaders, Macron and Habeck and Baerbock, and to some extent, of course, Scholz himself, about the war, the talk that they might escalate and lead their countries, France and Germany and the rest of Europe, into some kind of armed conflict with Russia, talk which is, of course, particularly prevalent in France, where President Macron has been continuously speaking in that way. Well, all of that has, unsurprisingly, alarmed people even further, and it is solidifying the anti-establishment votes in these countries, which we have seen. Now, a couple of days ago, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who is the major critic of European policy towards Russia and of the unqualified support for Ukraine, he spoke about the creation of a coalition for peace. And he said that electoral change in Europe, with the European Parliament elections acting as a catalyst, but possible electoral change in the United States might create the possibility for a strong anti-war coalition emerging, which will stop the drift towards an armed conflict with the West and Russia. Now, I thought this was over-optimistic when Orban said it, but I have to say, based on the results that have been pouring in, I'm now going to qualify that. It seems as if Orban, perhaps unsurprisingly, he is a politician after all, had a better sense of European opinion than I did. It looks as if perhaps Orban's hopes for an anti-war coalition emerging are not so far-fetched after all. One could perhaps start to see how it might happen. Hungary, of course, is always a part of the anti-war coalition. Slovakia, where Prime Minister Fico is now sufficiently recovered to make his first address to the Slovak people, is also a potential part of this anti-war coalition. If the Freedom Party wins in Austria, well, that might join in as well, in which case we will, by the way, have a very interesting situation where three of the former component parts of the former Habsburg Empire, Austria, Hungary and Slovakia, are coming together, but possibly with Slovenia and even Croatia to act as a break on the confrontation with Russia. Quite a shift, by the way, from the situation at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, when one of the major causes of the First World War was the fear of Russia that existed at that time in Vienna and in Austria-Hungary. But anyway, that's one part of Orban's coalition, which might be potentially taking shape. Then, of course, there's Italy with Giorgia Meloni, who seems to be now shifting away from the policy of belligerence and Atlanticism, which she had adopted previously. She seems to have realized that this is not welcome with Italian public opinion. And of course, the big one, the big question mark, is over France. Marine Le Pen has made it absolutely clear that she strongly opposes President Macron's plans to deploy French troops to Russia, and she's not keen on his idea of sending Mirage fighter jets to fight Russia in Ukraine. Marine Le Pen is not keen on Macron's idea to send Mirage fighter jets to Ukraine. She's always seemed to want some kind of more civil relationship with the Russians. And of course, if her party wins big in the parliamentary elections in France in a few weeks and is in a position to nominate the prime minister, forcing Macron into some kind of cohabitation arrangement, well, under the French constitution, the president remains in overall charge of foreign policy, but it will be clear that it is Le Pen and her party which is in the ascendant, and Macron, who is losing authority, and of course he cannot stand again as president in 3 years anyway. So it's likely that if Macron continues to push the very aggressive rhetoric and policies that he has done, he will find concerted opposition to him, this time from within the French government and from within the French National Assembly, in a way that he has never done up to now. And, well, it's difficult to say exactly how the cards would fall in France in any contest between a Le Penist government and a Macronist presidency. But with this trial of strength between the two, it's unlikely that France can take the lead in leading a European campaign against Russia in the way that Emmanuel Macron appears to have wanted to do. Now, I'm going to make one very general point about these elections, the ones that we have seen. In the run-up to these elections, we've had an astonishing anti-Russian campaign sweep Europe. There have been talk about Russian spies, about Russian sabotage of industrial facilities, about Russian propaganda campaigns influencing European voters. We've had an unending cranking up of the rhetoric. We've had Macron talking about sending troops to Ukraine. He's just announced that he's sending Mirage fighter jets to Ukraine. There's been talk about sending French instructors to Ukraine. All of this has been going on non-stop for the last couple of months. Well, it ought to be obvious now that this rhetoric, this kind of language, and this sort of policies is a vote loser with European voters. There are some people in Europe, quite a few people in Europe, who, of course, accept all of this. They entirely accept the rhetoric, the hostility to Russia, which many of them share. But many others don't. And governments and political leaders who talk in this way are more likely to lose support than to gain it. There are exceptions, Poland, Baltic states, but if one looks at the major European countries, this policy is not a success electorally or politically speaking. It is not the policy, I suspect, that the vast majority of Europeans want their leaders to follow. Most Europeans do not want to find themselves in a war. They're very unhappy about their material circumstances, the pressures that exist upon them. They probably have some vague understanding that the economic war that is being waged by their leaders against Russia has played a contributory part to this. But their major concern is not that they are pro-Russian or even anti-Ukrainian or anything like that. It is that they feel that their leaders are focused on an issue, Ukraine, which is remote from themselves, and that they are so obsessed with this issue that they're taking enormous risks with European security, which most Europeans emphatically do not agree with. Now, will the European leadership overall understand this? Will this cause them to change their policies? I fear not. It's possible that we will get Viktor Orban's anti-war coalition starting to appear, but one has to come back to the point I made at the start, which is that over 60% of the MEPs in the European Parliament remain aligned with the Atlanticist neoliberal majority. This remains true of all of the major European governments, and I suspect that the European political class overall, or perhaps I should say more precisely, the North European political class overall, which is the political class which is in control, they will not see these results as a warning. They will see them instead as a challenge, and that will make them want to intensify their policies even more. Anyway, there we go. For what it's worth, these were encouraging results. I am surprised that the results have turned out as they have, and I am mildly pleased that they have done so. I don't expect anything to change radically unless the outcome of the parliamentary elections in France turns out to be as dramatic as the results of the European parliamentary as dramatic as the results of the parliamentary European Parliament elections in France might suggest. But as to whether that will be so, I think it's premature for someone like me to say. Anyway, there we are. That's my overall view of these elections. I should say, and very much to my frustration, that I've not been able to find out whether the two MEPs that I want to see re-elected, Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, have indeed been re-elected in Ireland. I have been very surprised to see that not only the European media, but the Irish media says as little about them as possible. Well, perhaps not so surprised, but disappointed. But hopefully by the end of today, I will know the outcome. And I still hope, as of the time of making this programme, that they have been re-elected, though whether they have been or not, I don't actually know. Anyway, that's the situation in Europe. A vote, a qualified vote, if you like, for peace. Not one, however, that we should place too much reliance upon. We will see what happens from this point going forward and how the European leadership reacts. Let's now turn to that perennial topic, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Now, again, I say this without excuse. It is the war itself, the fighting that is going on, which ultimately is driving the outcome. Whatever the eventual outcome is going to be to this war, it'll be what the events on the battlegrounds, on the battlefield, have determined that will shape it. Anyway, what is going on the battlegrounds? Well, last night and early this morning, we got an awful lot of news that the Russians have crossed the border into Sumy region, and they have supposedly captured a village called Rizhivka. And there are indeed photos of Russian troops in this village. This is a Ukrainian border village called Rizhivka. And there's even a picture of a Russian soldier raising the Russian flag in this village. And Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen regional government within Russia, and obviously someone who takes an enormously involved and personal interest in the war on the Russian side. Anyway, his Telegram channel is apparently also claiming that the Russians are in control of this village. And many people are assuming that this proves in some way that the Russians have now opened their front in Sumy region. Now, this may be true. But I have to say, other than that news yesterday that this particular village might have been captured by the Russians, throughout all of today, I've been hearing nothing further about what is going on in Sumy region. It seems to me that unless things change radically over the next few hours, we're probably justified in seeing the events in this village, Rizhivka, as more a reconnaissance in force by the Russians than the start of an actual offensive. But we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll see what it is exactly that the Russians are planning. And for the moment, at least, it's difficult to draw any firm conclusions. But if we pivot further east to Kharkiv region, there I think we now have enough information to form a clear view of what is going on. And I'd say that we now have enough information in the form of pictures and reports from the actual battlefronts, which in their aggregate confirm what I myself have always believed, that the account of the fighting in Kharkiv region being provided by Group of Forces North is the correct one. It looks as if the Ukrainians have basically stopped their attacks in the Lipsy area towards the village of Glubovka. The Russians were able to hold their positions there. The Russians have also been advancing in the Lipsy area towards the southwest. We haven't heard much news about that today. One gets the sense that in the Lipsy area, for the moment, the situation continues to be relatively stable. But in Volchansk, arguably the more important battle for the much bigger place, it's clear that it is indeed the Russians who have the initiative. Now, the Russians tell us that they are in the process of capturing more buildings in this big factory complex, the so-called aggregate plant, strange name. I'm not sure what it makes, by the way, or made. But anyway, apparently the battle for this factory complex is underway. The Russians believe that if they capture this factory complex, then effectively the battle for Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, will indeed be over. The Ukrainian troops further north in the high-rise area, the so-called citadel, will indeed be fully cut off, and it will be impossible for them to continue to resist for very long. So the Russians are indeed advancing there. And in the eastern part of northern Volchansk, a group of forces north has been claiming Russian advances. Apparently, there is now photographic and film evidence which confirms this. A group of forces north say that the Ukrainians have attempted to stage counterattacks in this area, but that all of them have failed. And apparently, the latest film and photographic evidence appears to support that claim. So, despite all that we've been hearing over the last week or so about a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kharkiv area, so far it has not materialized. It is the Russians, on the contrary, who retain the initiative. Now, what that means, whether in fact the Ukrainians will eventually succeed in pulling themselves together and launching an offensive, I don't know. But I would say further this: Ukrainian cross-border artillery and missile strikes appear to have reduced significantly over the last couple of days. The Ukrainians still seem to be sending reinforcements to the Kharkiv area, but it seems that the Russians have complete aerial dominance, and Ukrainian reinforcements suffer heavy losses on the way to the battlefield area, and that is affecting Ukrainian deployment plans. And of course, I come back to that really distressing set of pictures that I saw of Ukrainian soldiers in the Kharkiv area, these tired old men, tired, unhealthy-looking old men. And I'm beginning to have serious doubts whether a serious offensive in this area is really possible. I suspect that the Ukrainians spun this story about an offensive basically to impress the Western powers, the Americans especially, and to get the Westerners to agree to allow them to launch cross-border strikes using Western weapons into Russia. And the reality has always been that even with these cross-border strikes, the Ukrainian army at this state in the war is simply not in a position to conduct sustained offensives anymore. Anyway, that's the situation in Kharkiv. The Russians continuing to incrementally gain control of Volchansk, still using only a part of their forces in this area. The Ukrainians and the Russians in a stalemate situation for the moment in Lipsy. If Volchansk does eventually fall to the Russians, then this will be a major blow psychologically and militarily to the Ukrainians, and it will create a crisis for Ukrainian forces further south in Kupiansk. Just saying. Anyway, that's the situation in Kharkiv region. There is a lot going on in other places too. Kharkiv region, further south in the Kupiansk area, the Russians continue to mop up various villages where east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. This is a complex battle which I've not followed in any particular detail, but anyway, it is ongoing. The Russians apparently making significant advances further south in the Liman area towards Siversk, and they seem to be advancing towards Siversk from several directions. It looks as if we're going to have a major battle for Siversk, probably at some point in the next couple of weeks, maybe around mid-July, early August, just saying. We've had less news from Chasov Yar. My sense is that the Russians are now consolidating control of the micro-district east of the aqueduct. There might still be some Ukrainian troops holding out in some buildings in the far west of the micro-district. But I saw a suggestion yesterday that the Russians control around 55% of the micro-district. 40% is said to be in the grey zone. That is to say that neither side fully controls it, and that the Ukrainians only control around 5% of the micro-district. So they're clinging on to just a few buildings. Of course, this is a report. It's not necessarily the truth. It's always difficult to gauge the truth about these sort of battles. But anyway, that does seem as if the battle for the micro-district is indeed coming very much to an end. The Russians, as I said, are securely positioned on the northern and southern flanks of Chasov Yar, west of the aqueduct, with the micro-district, once the micro-district falls fully under Russian control, and the Russians have consolidated control of the micro-district, then I expect an attack on Chasov Yar from multiple directions and a rapid collapse of Ukrainian positions in Chasov Yar over the course of the next couple of, once we've reached that point. And perhaps the most dramatic and important news is coming from the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. I said, I think about a day or so ago, that I thought that, from what I've been able to work out, that the Russians control around 70% now of Novoalexandrovka, this important village to the northwest of Ocheretino. More authoritative reports are putting it even higher. They're suggesting that the Russians control between 80 and 90% of Novoalexandrovka, and that the entire village is about to pass fully under Russian control within the next few hours. That would be a dramatic event, bringing the Russians very close to Ukraine's major supply roads, the roads Ukraine uses to supply all its forces in Donbass, and also to some of Ukraine's major logistics centers in Donbass. And also, it seems that the Russians have been advancing and expanding their territorial control west of Umansk and Italovo, and that they're now preparing to encircle Yasnobrodovka, the last village in this defense line, still under Ukrainian control, where Ukrainian troops will probably withdraw fairly soon, rather than let themselves be entrapped. And, well, there's been less news in the Novomikhailovka, Konstantinovka area, but in the Vremivka salient, the Russian Defense Ministry now tells us that the village of Staromayorsk, which the Ukrainians fought so hard to capture last year during their summer 2023 offensive, that Staromayorsk is now fully under Russian control. And that is coming from the Russian Defense Ministry. So, the drift, again, in the war is very clear. Now, the Russians, as I've said many times, are pushing all along the front lines. There's been much debate about what their ultimate military plans are. For the record, my own belief is that the Russians see the pivotal area, the place where the war, at least the battle for Donbass, will finally and conclusively be won. What I believe the Germans call the Schwerpunkt, the place which is where everything comes together. My sense is that this is still the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. So the major event, the key event now, is the fall of Novo-Alexandrovka, an event as momentous, if it happens, as the fall of Ocheretino itself. If the Russians do capture Novo-Alexandrovka over the next couple of hours, then the crisis that the Ukrainian military is facing will escalate even further and even further out of control. Now, all of this may explain why Ukrainian telegram channels, our old friends at Resident and Legitimi, are now telling us that relations between President Zelensky and his military chief, General Syrskyi, are deteriorating, and that Zelensky is becoming deeply critical of Syrskyi, because Syrskyi is not stabilizing the situation in the way that Zelensky would like, and is not leading the Ukrainian army into more successful and victorious offensives. I have to say, if this is true, and these are rumors, one can never know for a fact that they are true, but if this is true, then it absolutely does not surprise me. What is true, what is indisputable, is that the Ukrainian MP, Bezuglaya, who had become a trenchant critic of General Zaluzhny in the last few weeks that he was still overall military commander. Anyway, MP Bezuglaya has again come out and is making scathing criticisms again of Ukraine's military leadership. She is straightforwardly saying that Ukraine is losing the war, and she's blaming the incompetence of the military commanders for that fact. Now, Bezuglaya belongs to Zelensky's party, and when she was criticizing Zaluzhny, it was widely assumed that she was doing this at the instigation of Zelensky and of his rather tough Chief of Staff, Andrei Yermak. I'm starting to get the sense that whilst that might have been so back then, in the autumn of 2023, the situation has now evolved beyond that, and that Bezuglaya is now starting to make criticisms on her own, of her own will. I think that these attacks on Syrskyi and on the general staff are taking on a more general quality, and they seem to, as I said, essentially concede pending defeat in the war. I don't believe that she would be talking in this way if Zelensky and Yermak had been the people who were putting her up to talk in this fashion. But perhaps she's got word that the relationship between Zelensky and Syrskyi is deteriorating or has broken down, and perhaps she sees this as her chance and her opening so that she can make her own pitch. With Ukrainian politics, an absolute spider's nest, competing interests, it's impossible to know exactly who is doing what and for what reason, and what the purpose of any particular Ukrainian politician saying anything, what that reason actually is. But anyway, that's Bezaglia. So she's now becoming increasingly critical of the military leadership, supposedly Zelensky is, and the situation on the battlefronts shows why that criticism might now be taking place. Now, there are two really outstanding articles which have appeared recently, over the last 24 hours, which I do want to draw attention to. One is by the historian Jeff Roberts, a person who I should say I correspond with regularly, and who, of course, has appeared on the Duran. Glenn Deason and I have interviewed him, I think, several times. Exceptional biographer of Joseph Stalin. I say biographer. His book has been about Stalin's library, but I consider it effectively a Stalin biography. But anyway, Jeff Roberts, emeritus professor of history at University College Cork and a member of the Royal Irish Academy, he's written a really fine piece for Brave New Europe, one which I endorse its spirit completely. He says this, and this is addressed to Ukraine: negotiate now or capitulate later. 10 incentives for Ukraine to make peace with Russia. He points out that Ukraine's situation is worsening. The window to a compromise peace with Russia is fast closing. Western hardliners are urging Ukraine to expand its remaining military resources in the vain hope of stopping and reversing Russia's most recent advances, supposedly to strengthen Kiev's position in future negotiations with Moscow. But wishful thinking is not a strategy. There is no evidence Ukraine is capable of doing this. Ukraine's attempted counteroffensive in summer 2023, when both it and NATO were much stronger, was an unmitigated disaster. Ukraine's remaining ability to inflict significant military costs on Russia is a negotiating card that Kiev needs to play now. The weaker Ukraine is militarily, the less incentive Russia will have to negotiate a peace settlement as opposed to imposing one. That is a beautiful statement of the point I've been trying to make for, basically since the war began. With every day that passes, Ukraine's position weakens. Sometimes there's been ebb and flow. Sometimes Ukraine has seemed to be doing better than many people assumed, myself included, like during Ukraine's offensives in the autumn of 2022. But with every day, Russian power is starting to exert its weight. And Ukraine, even with the backing of the West, simply cannot match this. So the longer Ukraine delays in commencing negotiations, the weaker its position becomes, and assuming there is going to be any sort of negotiated peace at all, the longer Ukraine delays in negotiating that peace, the more onerous the terms of that peace will become. And Jeff Roberts makes the point that if Ukraine delays too long, it could lose Odessa. Donbass is all but lost. Kharkiv may eventually also be lost. The loss of Odessa, however, far more consequential for Ukraine than the loss of either of these places. In fact, the loss of Odessa would deprive Ukraine of its one route to the Black Sea and would make its economic future hostage ultimately to the Russians. And Jeff Roberts talks about the need to deal with Ukraine's catastrophic loss, demographic decline, to try to regain some control over its own sovereignty, not to be continuously a Western proxy, which has turned out to be so disastrous for Ukraine. And of course, as Jeff Roberts correctly says, Putin has in the past seemed willing to at least entertain the possibility of Ukraine joining the EU. Perhaps if there is a negotiated peace now, that might still be possible, though I'm far from convinced of it. Though one can also say that with the Russians cooling on the EU every single day, the likelihood at some point that the Russians will say no to that as well must be increasing also, unless negotiations begin now. And Jeff Roberts also makes the absolutely compelling and, in my opinion, correct point that allowing Western hardliners to control the outcome of the war, the course of the war, which is what we're seeing happen now, is potentially catastrophic. I'm going to read this passage. Western hardliners have no compunction when it comes to fighting to the last Ukrainian, and they are determined to escalate NATO's support for Ukraine, even to the risk of nuclear war with Russia. But Western escalationism is a sign of weakness, not a strength, a barometer of NATO's persistent failure and the inability of its guns, tanks, missiles, mercenaries, sanctions, sabotage, technicians, intelligence, targeting and terrorism to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. All-out war, nuclear war, would be catastrophic, not least for Ukraine, which would be wiped out in the first wave of attacks. And this is absolutely correct. Why does Ukraine still place so much faith on the West when the West has already failed so completely? And if the West, for its part, doubles down in the way that I and others, and Jeff Roberts also, fear, and we end up in a nuclear conflagration, which, though I hope that can be averted, it remains, unfortunately, a possibility, then all one can say about that is that that will be no victory for Ukraine. That would be the end of Ukraine, as it might be of all of us. So, what possible rational reasons are there for not sitting down and negotiating? I've made this point myself many, many times. I cannot understand why Western governments are so resistant to this idea, not just at the highest political level, but anywhere, even within their bureaucracies. And of course, for the Ukrainians themselves, one would have thought by now that the logic of seeking peace is compelling, and Jeff Roberts explains why. Now, there's a second article which I'm going to discuss more briefly, because I'm still thinking a lot about its implications, but it's by Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism. And she makes another point, which is that assuming that the Russians do not want to occupy the whole of Ukraine, and I think that is a very good assumption. I think the Russians understand that the further west they go, the more difficult it would become for them to assimilate and absorb parts of Ukraine that have been historically very hostile to them. Anyway, the further the Russians go, the more difficult it becomes for them, and more likely than not, they do not want to go there. But there has to be questions about what the Russians might do if the West continues along the lines that it is doing at the moment, which is to refuse to negotiate at all. Now, I need to read this article, as I said, more carefully, given the care that it outlines, with which it outlines its arguments. But the point ultimately is, or so it seems to me, that the Russians, and I do get this sense, do not want to go to the far western edge of Ukraine. They do not want to occupy places like Lvov, for example. They might eventually, and this is my view, the way things are going, be left without any choice. And that would obviously be a catastrophe for Europe, might not be so good for Russia. The Russians probably over time would be able to cope with that. But what will it do to Ukraine? What will it do to Ukraine, to the Ukrainians who are there, if the Russians whom they don't want come back? Well, I'm going to give my own guess. I think a lot of these people in Western Ukraine will probably leave. And where will they go? They will try to go to the West. And what will the West do if these people in their millions start to come? Now, I want to make it clear, the last part of this comes from me. It's not there yet. It's not there in Eve Smith's article, which, as I said, I have to think about more deeply. But we can see how, again, delaying negotiations, seeking to fight this war to the last Ukrainian, could have terrible implications for everybody, for the Russians who might occupy territory, find themselves in occupation and control of territory they don't want, for the Ukrainians who would have a terrible choice between what they might see as an occupation or an emigration, which, by the way, might compromise the future of Ukraine, of Ukrainian identity in the land of Ukraine, and of course for Europe as well, which might have to cope with another mass movement of people caused by another failed war. Anyway, there we are. All of these are dark thoughts. Let's now turn to another topic, which is one I've talked about much. There's been more commentary about the World Bank's recalculation of the size of the Russian economy. Its acknowledgement that Russia overtook Japan somewhere before 2021, and that Russia today has the fourth biggest economy in the world on a purchasing power parity basis. And I'm going to give myself something of a victory lap over this. I mentioned when I previously discussed this that I'd been discussing and commenting and writing about this all before. I I don't think I have ever before read out my own words in one of these programs, and I apologize for doing so. I hope this doesn't look too boastful. But looking back on things I've been writing and things that you can find published, well, you will find that on the 7th of October 2015, I wrote something like, I wrote this. It's a short article, publicly based. Its title, by the way, is "The Syrian Campaign Nails Myths About the Size of Russia's Economy." Anyway, this is what I wrote then in October, 7th October 2015, 9 years ago, in other words. And it was specifically about the size of the Russian economy. It's a short piece, under 600 words. Anyone who reads Western media coverage of Russia's intervention in Syria will notice that a note of bafflement has crept in. How can Russia, the country that doesn't produce anything, whose economy is supposedly smaller than Britain's or Spain's, and which is said to be economically on the ropes, able to conduct an air campaign in Syria? The short and obvious answer is that Russia's economy is much bigger than Western political leaders and commentators imagine. Not only would Britain or Spain be unable to mount the sort of air campaign the Russians are waging in Syria, they cannot run a huge space program, develop rockets like the Angara rockets, build a space center like Vostochny, develop the Arctic, construct nuclear-powered icebreakers, or feed themselves. Nor can they build a bridge as rapidly as the one the Russians are building to Crimea. Note that this was written in 2015. Nor can they create alternatives to Google, like Yandex, or alternatives to GPS, like GLONASS, or alternatives to SWIFT, like the Russians have done in just a few months. In military production, any idea, any European state can simultaneously develop fifth-generation fighter jets like the Sukhoi T-50, that's the Sukhoi 57, tanks like the Armata, submarines like the Yasen and Borei, or missiles like the Bulava and the Yars is sheer fantasy. Well, of course, we now know that the difference between the Russian military-industrial complex and that in Europe is far greater than even I imagined that it was back in 2015. Anyway, to continue what I wrote in October 2015. Russia does all these things and much else. It does them without strain. In the middle of a recession, Russia's budget, this is in 2015, Russia's budget deficit is 3% of GDP. For the record, we've now got figures for Russia's budget deficit in the first 5 months of this year, the period covering January to May, and it has come out at 0.5% of GDP. Just reminding again that just a few programs ago, I was talking about somebody who seemed to be predicting another fiscal crisis in Russia. Russia, as I said, running a budget deficit at the moment of 0.5% of GDP. Anyway, to return to my old article, it does them without strain. In the middle of a recession, Russia's budget deficit is 3% of GDP, less than Britain's or Spain's, and roughly the same as the US. Its balance of trade is in surplus. So far from being financially exhausted, Russia has far lower levels of debt than any Western state. Are Russians accepting lower living standards to pay for these things? Hardly. Until this year, that year being not 2015, living standards grew in Russia every year since 1998. This year's fall in living standards is a one-off caused by the inflation that resulted from last year's devaluation of the ruble. It has now run its course. In fact, because of very tight monetary policies, living standards in Russia did remain static for several years after I wrote this article, but they're now once again growing fast. Anyway, continuing. Based on my own necessarily subjective impressions, living standards in much of Russia, especially in Moscow, now compare favourably with the best in Europe. That was a far-out comment to make in 2015. Westerners who now travel to Moscow increasingly share it. What are the claim Russia can only do these things because of money it gets from energy sales? Not only is this wildly exaggerated, the energy industry accounts for just 16% of Russia's GDP. I believe the current figure is around 9%, but that's, again, my own estimate. To continue. But it treats the energy industry as if it was not a resource, which is absurd. It's a point I've made many times. Besides, saying this ignores the fact that Russia is able to do, not import, many of the things which it is doing. Most people accept the conventional measure of Russia's GDP based on US dollars is wrong. The IMF and the World Bank prefer to estimate Russia's GDP on the basis of purchasing power parity. On that basis, Russia has the world's fifth biggest economy, roughly the size of Germany's. Now, there was a brief period around 2015 when Russia seemed to overtake Germany, and then it fell back again. This is all based on PPP estimates. And then I went on to say this. Even that estimate is, in my opinion, wrong. It is not that the statistics are wrong. It is that what is being compared are sets of statistics rather than two totally different economies. I know Germany well. I can confidently say that Russia's economy operates on a far bigger scale. It is physically impossible for Germany to do many of the things Russia does without effort. Conversely, there is nothing Germany does that Russia cannot do if it commits itself to doing it. The only economies that can match or surpass Russia's in technology and depth of resources and can do all the things Russia does are those of China and the US. India, Germany, and Japan can also do some of the things Russia does, but not all of them. No other states come close. Well, there you go. I said all of that in 2015. And now that we know that 6 years later, 2021, according to the World Bank, Russia overtook Japan on the purchasing power parity basis. And it's been the fourth biggest economy since then, since 2021, according to the World Bank. And the World Bank now admits that even this calculation almost certainly underestimates the true scale of the Russian economy, because 40% of Russia's economy operates in ways that the World Bank's data collectors are unable to capture, so that it is perhaps 40% bigger than even the latest estimate from the World Bank, which would mean that Russia's economy is at about $10 trillion on a purchasing power parity basis. More than a third the size of the economy of the United States. Well, that, I think, ultimately explains everything. In 2022, in February 2022, the Western powers launched an economic war against Russia because they based all their calculations on the nominal GDP levels that they were told Russia had, which put its economy at just $2 trillion, gave it a GDP of just $2 trillion. It never crossed their minds that they were dealing with an economy that was perhaps 5 times bigger. 5 times bigger. Anybody who'd been to Russia, worked there any length of time, would have warned them years ago that they were wrong. Now, there is no great insight, by the way, in what I wrote in 2015, and I've since spoken to many people who have known Russia well, Westerners, and they all, I've discovered, had the same view as me. But of course, none of them were consulted. We could see how the mistake was made, how the incredible blunder that was made in February 2022 took place. And if all of these European political leaders who are now risking their political future and perhaps survival could just take a step back and think about how it was that they came to the position in which they're in now, well, they would understand the nature of the mistake they made back in February 2022, and they would perhaps advise or warn their successors to consult more widely before making the same kind of decision in future. In the meantime, based on the European Parliament elections, they will have to pay the electoral and political cost of their titanic mistake. Well, that's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we're currently selling a new range, Football 24. You can get a discount apparently for all the things there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.